Thank you for joining us. I'm Jeffrey Lewis. I'm the director of the Nuclear Strategy and Nonproliferation Initiative here at the New America Foundation. It's great to see so many people out for yet another event. We've had a string of these things where we seem to get pretty darn close to capacity and end up using the overflow room. So I'm immensely gratified to see that. I suppose the reason is because people are intensely interested in this issue of nuclear terrorism, and so although I think we have two fantastic speakers, there's a way in which I hope that the talk is in some small way disappointing, because I think is not going to be alarmist, and it's not going to be sensational. It's one of the great things about both of our speakers is the very matter-of-fact and straightforward way in which they think about nuclear terrorism, not just as a substantive concern, but as a sort of intellectual exercise, how you frame and discuss these issues and how that impacts our policy choices. Now, I say that as a little bit of penance. Outside in the front, we have an article that I co-authored, of which I frankly am very proud, because it was a tremendously fun exercise. But some people have pointed out that that in the task of sort of trying to estimate how difficult a nuclear terrorist attack would be to mount, that maybe we got a little carried away with ourselves and had a little bit too much fun. Our speakers today, though, I don't think suffer from that flaw that I do, and I think you're all very lucky to have both of them. First, we have Michael Levy. I've known Mike now for what seems like a very long time, and I suspect Mike and I are going to be seeing a lot of each other over the next 30, 40 years here in Washington. Mike is currently a Science and Technology Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and has written this excellent book on nuclear terrorism, which is available out front. You actually get a deal. It's $24.95 is the cover price, but we're selling them for $20. So, if you want to help put Mike's future kids through college someday, you might go ahead and pick up a copy. This is actually Mike's second book. He also wrote an excellent book called The Future of Arms Control with Michael O'Hanlon during a previous incarnation at Brookings. Mike is going to talk about some of the concepts in the book, some of the really, I think the way to think about what Mike's going to say is an issue of how to think about nuclear terrorism, so much as what to think. And then after that, we're going to have Priscilla Lewis, and I should note that Priscilla and I are not related, even though we both work at the New America Foundation and have the same last name. Priscilla is probably the most patient person in the world, because she gets most of my emails for reasons that I still don't understand. She directs. I just
don't get any email. That's the problem.
She directs our U.S. in the World initiative and is the Deputy Director of the American Strategy Program, where I am housed, and previously was a program officer for peace and security at Rockefeller Brothers. Is that right? So you can't have two better qualified and more interesting people to talk about a more important subject. So, Mike?
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for having me here. It's wonderful to see so many people out here. I've been talking about this book in a lot of places, but this is actually the first public lecture or discussion, I hate to use the word lecture, in Washington. So it's wonderful to see that people here are still engaged and interested in the issue. I will try, as Jeff suggested, to have absolutely no fun and to disappoint you. Let me give you the basic premise of this. I should add one other thing. I know Jeff distributed the article. Part of my goal here is going to be to convince you, not necessarily why that article is wrong, and I'm not going to go after it, but how you might think about not only that article, but any piece of writing or discussion of nuclear terrorism that you look at. And try to give you some different lenses to look at the issue and to parse and understand things. So here's the basic idea behind the book. Nuclear terrorism hasn't happened. And even a well-developed nuclear plot hasn't been seen. And that's a good thing. We don't want to see nuclear terrorism happen. But there is a dangerous flip side to it. Because nothing's happened, it's very easy to get carried away with our imaginations when we start thinking about nuclear terrorism. It's very easy to dream up fantastic terrorist schemes, to fixate on worst-case scenarios, and to take those to their policy conclusions. So what I've tried to do in this book is to take nuclear terrorism, take our thinking about nuclear terrorism, and ground it in reality as much as we can. take lessons from as broad a number of areas as we can, whether it's from closely related things like technology, like traditional counterterrorism, whether it's from the drug world or from other sorts of examples. Keeping in mind that nuclear terrorism is unique, but also trying as hard as we can to really learn and to try to ground ourselves. Let me start with a little story. About a year and a half ago, the General Accountability Office did one of its many stings on the U.S. nuclear detection programs, on the U.S. border security programs for nuclear weapons and materials. Now, normally what they do is they'll take something and they'll try to move it through a border crossing and through a radiation detector and see whether or not they succeed. This was different. This actually responded to one of the concerns about those approaches. What was the concern? The concern was that groups might just go around those crossings. There are a lot of remote stretches of border that aren't all that well monitored. How well could we do in those areas? So what happened? Someone drove up to the United States from the Canadian side of the border with an SUV, got out with a small gym bag, 4 canisters of weapons-grade, small canisters, weapons-grade uranium. This is the material that's easiest to use in making a terrorist nuclear weapon. Got out of the SUV, carried it across the border about 10 meters, handed it to an accomplice. Accomplice went off. 3 out of 4 times, they succeeded. Though on one of those occasions, someone did alert authorities that by the time authorities came, folks were gone. One of the times, the sting failed, and they were stopped at the border. Now, the immediate reaction when you look at something like that is to say, 1 in 4 chance of stopping a nuclear terrorist attack. This is absolutely unacceptable. And in a sense, it really is unacceptable. The consequences of a nuclear attack could be enormous. You could look at 100 or 200,000 people dead. But at the same time, you need to put it in context. First, remember that this is only one part of a nuclear terrorist plot. A group has to go through a lot of things. It has to go through acquiring nuclear materials or weapons. It has to build a weapon or activate a weapon that it's acquired. Then it has to move it around and all the pieces around. It has to hire people, and then it has to detonate it. And each of those parts can be broken down into more pieces. Now put it in that context, and let's say, just for the sake of thinking, that you had 10 of those strung together. What's the net result? About a 5%, 1 in 20 chance of the terrorist group succeeding. If you had 5 of them linked together, it would be something less than 1 in 2. And then go beyond that and put yourself in the shoes of someone thinking about whether to attempt an attack in the first place and say, is a 5% chance of succeeding enough? So this is just a bit of how to frame thinking. Now, of course, you can come back and say, well, there aren't 10 steps with a 1 in 4 chance of a terrorist group failing. But there may be ways that a group can get around a lot of these. Absolutely. But as a starting point, we need to look at this carefully. And it reminds me of something that we've heard a lot in the last several years. We hear a lot that we have to succeed every time in preventing a terrorist plot. A terrorist group only needs to succeed once. The president says it a lot. You hear it on both sides of the aisle. It's not original. It actually comes from the IRA, from a failure to kill Margaret Thatcher back in 1984, and they issued a press release roughly along those lines. But when you dig inside a nuclear plot, well, inside any plot, but particularly inside a complex plot, it does get flipped on its head. The terrorist group has to succeed every time, and we only need to succeed once to stop them. Now, this seems kind of obvious, but it actually does not happen. This way of thinking often does not happen when we think about nuclear plots. Why? There's a tendency to do the following thing. You look at one piece of a defense, you say, well, this isn't particularly effective, we really shouldn't think about this, we need to focus on something else. And then you do that repeatedly with all sorts of different parts of a defense and with all sorts of different terrorist hurdles. And you add them all up together, 0 and 0 and 0 and 0, and what is your answer? 0. This is useless as a group. This is not unique to nuclear terrorism. If you look at psychological studies of economic behavior, the same sort of pattern shows up. The most interesting area that I find with this is in moral philosophy. Moral philosophers look at this phenomenon to try to explain why people are willing to do a lot of little bad things, but not one really big bad thing. Same sort of phenomenon in thinking. They call it the lottery paradox. So that's one piece of how I like to frame thinking about nuclear terrorism. Now, what I've talked about is what specialists call layered defense. You've got different pieces, different barriers along the way to terrorist success. One of the things that I really wanted to do in this book was move beyond this layered defense framework, to talk about defense as a system. Defense as a system is very different in some ways from a layered defense. It's an evolution from it, but it's quite different. Why? What matters with a layered defense is how and whether any piece of a defense stops a terrorist plot. And then you put all these together and look at it as a whole. What it doesn't look at is how any part of the defense alters a terrorist plot, even if it fails to stop it. Okay? So for example, I can look at border security measures. And I can say, well, if I break down my nuclear weapon, my nuclear materials into small pieces, I'll get all of these things across. So it's not so easy to stop it. Fine. We can think that way. But we have to look at it in the broader context, and you have to then look at the challenge of putting it together, of building a bomb, of assembling things inside the United States or whatever country you're getting into. So there are trade-offs. In the process of succeeding against that border security part, you're making yourself more vulnerable to law enforcement. And you could work it the other way around. You say, I don't want to be vulnerable to law enforcement. I'm going to bring something much more bulky across. That makes you more vulnerable to border security. You need to look at these things as a system. How do they work together? There's another way of thinking about that, which is every barrier you add on can drive a group to need to recruit more people. This is one sort of manifestation of this that's particularly important. The more people are added to a nuclear conspiracy, the higher a chance there is that someone's going to rat it out, that it's going to be exposed not in a nuclear way, but through traditional law enforcement and intelligence. It's another basic piece there. Sports analogies are kind of overdone, but I do like to think of a bit of a baseball analogy, and I should say baseball analogies are even more overdone than sports analogies. But here's the analogy. In baseball, if you look at a whole team and you look at any one player, you can misunderstand the value of that player if you don't isolate them properly. A lot of you probably read Michael Lewis's book Moneyball a few years back, and some of you may even be into this kind of quantitative baseball statistics. But there was a lot of interesting effort, and there has been, to isolate the behavior of particular players. If you have a really good pitcher, they can make a bad shortstop look good. If you have a bad pitcher, they can make a good shortstop look bad. You can't look at any one piece by itself. You can't test any one piece by itself. You can't analyze any one piece by itself. Let me give you a bit of an intuitive feel for how I think through the second part, which is grounding nuclear terrorism more sharply in reality. And there are two basic pieces to this. The first is it's important to ground thinking about nuclear terrorism in the reality of how terrorist groups actually function, how they're built, how they go about their business, how leaders make decisions. Again, sounds straightforward, but it's something that really does not happen. The nuclear world and the terrorism world do not communicate well with each other. If you look at the WMD Intelligence Commission report, what you found is that before 2001, in analyzing al-Qaeda WMD activities in Afghanistan, the people who knew about al-Qaeda, the people who knew about WMD, and the people who knew about Afghanistan didn't talk to each other. Okay, I'm not just talking about sharing tactical intelligence coming along the way, which we've talked about a lot, just creating their models of what the threat might look like and what might be possible. There wasn't work together. And that distorts our picture, again, of how nuclear terrorism works. Let me give you a couple pieces that I think are interesting on that front. The first, and I always get into discussions about this, and I suspect people will ask about it. When terrorism scholars look at ambitious terrorist groups, they find that a lot of the most ambitious groups are quite averse to failure. Okay? That's different from them being worried about retaliation, which is what we focused on. Suicidal terrorists not worried about retaliation. That often coexists with a real fear of failing to pull off an attack that a lot is invested in. There are a variety of different ways to think about this. One is simply to look at the empirical record. Another is to say it's a sort of natural selection. It's difficult to build up a lot of strong capabilities if you keep on failing and running into walls and throwing your specialists off cliffs. Another part that Brian Jenkins, one of the leading scholars of terrorism, has thrown out there is he's said for a lot of religious terrorists, in their minds, failing is tantamount to God's judgment, that they're failures. Now that's, maybe you agree, maybe you don't. If it's true, it's a lot of weight on the shoulders of someone trying to pull off a plot. There's something closely related to that, and that is a tendency to be conservative in operations. And I should be clear, I'm not trying to replace a worst case threat with a best case threat. I'm saying these are possibilities. If you're afraid of failure, you tend to stick to your bread and butter techniques. You are not necessarily endlessly innovative. In discussions of nuclear terrorism amongst specialists, there tends to be a pattern that goes something like this. We could do a particular defensive move. Then someone says, well, a terrorist could dream up this or that way of getting around it. Let's say we controlled American borders. And I use borders a lot as an example, just because we have some intuitive feel. Say we controlled all the seaports in the United States. Okay, someone would just bring in something through the Canadian border. Well, let's say we did a better job in the populated areas of Canada. Oh, well, someone would just go up into the northern tundra, they'd sail a boat across the Atlantic, bring things down. This is not uncommon in discussions. But it's not clear that terrorist groups easily shift to these sorts of, or that a lot of groups easily shift to these sorts of approaches. Groups can be quite conservative in their operations. Does that mean we discount the possibility that they will shift? No. But it means that it can be very useful to look at past patterns of terrorist behavior and then to look at nuclear plots that would essentially be small variations on those other terrorist plots and pay special attention to those in thinking about how to design defenses. If terrorist groups tend to come across legal border crossings, we may want to put special emphasis on nuclear plots that use those sorts of things. If there are certain ways a particular group recruits, we may want to look at variations on those that would be used to recruit nuclear scientists, engineers, technicians. We can also look at the more extreme possibilities, but it might be useful to overweight those things. I'm not going to give an example of terrorist group structure, but I could talk about that later. I think there are some very interesting differences between the abilities, for example, of hierarchical groups and cellular groups to pull off a nuclear attack. I'll just throw it as an assertion that it's going to be much easier for a hierarchical group to do it. We can come back to it. We also should ground things a bit in technical reality and, again, in experience reality. And I can give a few examples, and you can work through these at an analytical level, but I want to give you a sort of intuitive feel. So here's one example. People will throw out in talking about how easy or hard it is to make a nuclear weapon that there are instructions out there on the internet. Great, okay? Instructions are the easy part. The engineering is harder, and really the tough stuff is the nitty-gritty technical work. And frankly, there's a bias amongst people, the technical people who think about these issues, who tend to have backgrounds like mine in esoteric theoretical physics. And there's a bit of a conceit that whatever we do must be the hard stuff, and whatever everyone else does must be the easy stuff. I've succumbed to it too, and most of us get to it. Though there really are two categories. There's one that thinks like that. There's the other that understands that if they ever step near anything that functions, they'll break it. And I really had this driven into me when a few years back the fan blower motor was broken in my car. I ordered a very detailed book of instructions on how to fix pretty much everything in my particular car. I got it, I went to my car, I started working on it. 5 hours later, this is making the fan work. The automatic shifting system was completely immobilized. I couldn't take the key out of the ignition because the car thought it was still driving because of what happened to the automatic shifting system. And the battery was draining. Now maybe that means you just shouldn't be scared that I might pull off a nuclear attack. But it should remind you there is a difference between ideas and implementation. There is a big difference between ideas and implementation, especially if you don't get a lot of practice runs. And if you have limited technical expertise, you have limited materials and resources, that can make a real difference. And there are real-world nuclear examples of that, and one I'll throw out really quickly to you. Libya had plenty of instructions and a lot of equipment for processing uranium. It never got close to having any capability there. Now, there are different standards for a state, but there are also different capabilities for a state. Again, there's a difference between instructions and knowledge and actually putting things into practice. There's a fallacy I love to pick apart because it also pervades a lot of thinking about nuclear terrorism and actually about a lot of other kinds of terrorism. And here it is. If a group can do the following hard thing, then they must be able to do the following easier thing. If they can get nuclear materials, they can build a bomb. If they can build a bomb, they can move it across borders. If they can move it across borders, they can hide it and then go and detonate it. There's some logic to that, but these pieces don't necessarily follow that way, and it's important to be very careful there. I had a discussion yesterday in a talk I gave up in Boston where someone said they agreed with me on this and then proceeded to give an example that completely contradicted it. Not realizing that, because it really is intuitively built in. I'll give you a couple reasons why we shouldn't fall into that trap too much. One is that different kinds of capabilities don't necessarily translate into each other. A group may be very good at stealing things. That doesn't mean that it's good at pulling off technical work. A group may be very good at pulling off technical work. It doesn't mean that it's good at corrupting transport systems around the world. People always bring up this example, what happens if there are a group of disgruntled physicists in a Pakistani academic lounge and they decide to do something dangerous? Well, they're dangerous, but how do they bring all the other pieces in? Maybe they can, but you have to ask these questions. So different capabilities work differently. And the other that comes up throughout and connects back to this whole layered or system approach is that mistakes happen. Just because a group can succeed in a hard part doesn't mean they're not going to simply screw things up in an easier part. And we should be prepared to take advantage of those sorts of mistakes. And I think back to the attempt of, and we talk about British doctors who tried to blow up these bombs last year in England. They weren't actually all doctors. I think it was a couple doctors and an engineer. They all worked for the National Health Service, so this is the confusion. They took their bombs, they put them in a car, they parked them in front of a nightclub in a, what do you call it, double yellow, so no parking zone. Bombs didn't go off, but how was the plot really uncovered? It was in a no parking zone. Someone went, looked at it because of that, and then uncovered the rest of the plot. Okay? Now, the logic says they're smart enough to do this and they're smart enough to do that, so they must be smart enough not to put it in this no parking zone. Yeah, smart enough, but that doesn't mean that things don't go wrong. Now, is that particular problem a fluke? Sure. But that doesn't mean it's a fluke that something went wrong along this long chain of events. And I'd give an example of how I accidentally got caught with nitroglycerin on my laptop at the National Airport. It's the same similar kind of thing. I didn't know that it was on my laptop. I'd just been testifying up on the Hill with someone who dealt with bomb detection in the U.S. government. I shouldn't have shook their hand. But I won't tell you, but the only reason it got detected was because of a complete fluke. Again, you still have to worry about things, especially if you put yourself in the shoes of someone thinking about whether it's worth pulling off an attack. I wasn't thinking of doing that. Now, not everything is good news, and as I went through it, I had other experiences that weren't encouraging. I managed to become designated as someone who could provide authority to anyone in a chunk of London to get certain computer codes that could simulate a lot of interesting nuclear things that could be useful for a weapon. I won't give more details than that, but that was kind of disturbing. They had me doing this out of my house. They posted it on the internet, completely unintentional. So you do have to be careful. There are a lot of things that turn out to be more dangerous when you get into the nitty-gritty. Let me give a very quick rundown of policy implications, then I'll make one other comment. Some basic policy implications. If you're thinking about a broad system, you can't really end up with your three-point plan for fixing things. Okay? If you think there are 3 basic barriers to making or pulling off a nuclear attack, then you can give your 3-point plan for defeating those barriers. If you say it's about a broad system, then you really need to talk about how you develop that system. I'm not going to give you my 278-point plan for putting all the pieces in that system in place. But what you do need to do are institutionalize a few of the following things. You need the right intelligence assessment. So you need to look at a range of possible threats, not just worst case, but including worst case, but also other variations. You need some coordination, but it's not going to be a czar and a big top-down thing. A lot of the pieces of defense against nuclear terrorism have nothing to do with nuclear aspects per se. A lot of nuclear smuggling attempts, for example, are generally defeated because someone picks up a terrorist conspiracy, not because of anything particularly nuclear. Okay, so you're bringing in a lot of different pieces. That means you can't have top-down command coordination because you're basically pulling in the entire national security establishment and a good bit beyond that. You want some bottom-up coordination. What you'd like is sort of a plan that lays out all the pieces so people can see where they fit in and so they can put them together. You have to really empower the front lines of defense. A lot of this system is local officials, state officials. When I talk about detecting terrorist plots, I talk about how you have hundreds of thousands of detectors out there. They're called law enforcement officers. You want to empower them to be effective against nuclear plots. Problem, the federal government doesn't like to tell anyone without a Q clearance much about nuclear weapons, or about nuclear terrorism. We have to think through how secrecy can be useful in a lot of ways, but can impede our ability to empower the folks who may be very effective in preventing nuclear terrorism. And also, if we're going to deter terrorist groups or dissuade them from pursuing attacks because they might be too difficult, we probably have to tell them something to convince them of that. That also gets into this secrecy problem. Let me end by preempting the question I always get, which is how likely is a nuclear terrorist attack? And it kind of fits into the title of this, which I didn't come up with, but I think is really apt, is nuclear terrorism an overrated or underrated threat? And I think the answer is yes. It is overrated and underrated in different important ways. And when I think about the answer, I put people into three different categories on their assessment of the likelihood of a nuclear attack. The first are the zealots, okay? I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but in a descriptive way. We have the nuclear zealots. It's very likely, sky is falling. It usually comes with a prescription for making the odds just above zero. But that's that category of the zealots. And I think they tend to overstate the threat. You have what I call the nuclear atheists, who say the threat is essentially zero, and we really should stop paying so much attention to it. Let's focus on other more likely things. I'd encourage people to put themselves in a third category, which I call the pragmatic agnostics. Okay? Agnostic because you're not quite sure how likely a nuclear terrorist attack is. And here the danger is that there are a lot of people who dismiss it, who underestimate the threat in important ways, and so don't put the right effort and enough effort and resources into dealing with the threat. But it's also important that they don't overestimate it, because when you overestimate the threat, you miss opportunities to do things about it. If you have this 10-foot-tall terrorist group that can evade almost any obstacle you put up, you end up dismissing those obstacles or not taking them seriously or thinking seriously through how to build the best possible defense. Okay? And then you miss a lot of opportunities. You're not being pragmatic in that case. And what, in the end, you don't want to be is you don't want to be the cop who gets up in the morning and says, some of the bad guys have armor-piercing bullets, so I'm going to leave my bulletproof vest at home today. And you come across another bad guy who has bullets, but they're not armor-piercing. And you're not protected against it, not because you underestimated the threat, but because you overestimated it. So both are dangerous, and we have to be careful to avoid the two extremes and use that to build the best possible defense.
Priscilla.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm really pleased to be on this particular panel, and I think you'll see why when I tell you a little bit about the kind of work that I've been doing and how it intersects in some interesting ways with the subject of Mike's presentation. The U.S. and the World Initiative is a resource for advocates and experts who want to talk to Americans, to the mainstream American public, about a cooperative, constructive, principled, and pragmatic role for the United States in the world. We develop messaging tools and resources that combine insights from public opinion analysis and communications research with the kind of real-world experience of advocates and experts who are in the business of communicating with the American public. We look to understand how the public thinks, not just what the public thinks, and why people reach the conclusions they reach, and to identify opportunities for encouraging new ways of thinking about global issues and foreign policy choices. Our approach is based on a core insight from cognitive science, which some of you are probably familiar with. It's the notion that when people are confronted with new information, they draw on familiar constructs or familiar narratives in order to make sense of it. And what that implies for advocacy or for public education is that simply jamming in more facts is not enough. You often have to change the constructs or the narratives that are guiding the way people are thinking about your particular issue. The way this is sometimes put is that if the facts don't fit the frame, it's the frame that's kept and the facts that are rejected. So you may have heard that in various forms. Having said that, I think you can see why I've actually listened to Mike with a great deal of excitement and read some of his writings with a great deal of excitement, because it seems to me his argument is fundamentally about the power of framing, about how the way we understand a problem, like nuclear terrorism, shapes the way we try to solve it, and how misunderstanding a problem, even in ways that are not particularly gross, like taking a part to stand for the whole or something like that, actually end up distorting our policy processes significantly. Now that sounds obvious, the notion that the way you think about a problem is going to shape the way you go about solving it, but in fact the implications of it are not necessarily obvious. At least to me, it's not intuitively obvious that looking at a particularly horrific threat should end up producing a less robust set of defenses rather than a more robust set of defenses. Nor is it entirely obvious how focusing on worst-case scenarios converts them into illustrative scenarios which begin to kind of define the problem. So while Mike has focused on how our understanding of an issue shapes policy outcomes, I'm going to talk a bit about how the way we talk about an issue, how communicators frame an issue, influences public thinking and public opinion outcomes. As I just suggested, the thing to remember about talking is that whatever we say interacts with what's already in people's heads. Our audiences are not blank slates. The construct or the story that gets evoked by our communication, even if we evoke it inadvertently, will have its own logic and is going to lead, and we call it like a hidden path of reasoning, to a particular conclusion. So what you intend to say as a communicator, what you mean, is only half of the communications picture. How you're heard or understood is the other essential half. And again, it sounds obvious until you remember how frequently we all forget it and react with surprise when the person we're talking to ends up hearing us in a completely different way than we intended. And for people who are experts on issues or who care passionately about something, it's particularly tempting to focus only on the imparting and not on the receiving end of communicating, to forget the importance of talking so you can be heard. To give you a sense of how critical it is to understand how your audience might be likely to hear you, I'm going to offer a brief cautionary tale. And it's not directly related to terrorism or to nuclear terrorism, but I think it will resonate with all of you who think about foreign policy issues. For years, advocates and experts and communicators, and I include myself in this list, have been using the phrase U.S. global engagement to refer to the entirety of America's global role. And in fact, we mean it to emphasize in particular, in some ways, the non-military dimensions of U.S. of America's global role, the economic, the humanitarian, the environmental, the diplomatic dimensions of our place in the world. In November 2007, an opinion survey sponsored by the UN Foundation produced a stunning finding. It turns out that for most Americans, global engagement means military engagement. Their first thought on hearing that phrase is of boots on the ground, the physical presence of American troops in another country. In other words, almost exactly the opposite of what most users of that phrase intend to convey. What this suggests is that the American public is in some ways losing its sense that there are non-military ways to interact with the world. And I'm using this as an example because it has such powerful policy implications, or powerful implications for the public's policy preferences. With our lens on the world restricted primarily to the war in Iraq and a discredited, largely, war on terrorism, it turns out that many Americans who were previously strong supporters of an active U.S. role in global problem solving have begun to wonder if it's possible for the United States to be a force for good in the world. And particularly among Democrats and self-identified progressives, you have more and more people choosing the box on the survey that says the best thing we can do is to stay at home and mind our own business. There are many other examples of how kind of received notions and worldviews can shape how an audience hears us, often in unexpected ways. And I'm sure Mike has some cautionary tales of his own about stubborn frames, about readers or people in audiences who came up to him and said, "Are you saying that we don't have to worry about terrorism?" When in fact what he's been trying to offer is a detailed and closely reasoned argument about how to defend ourselves more effectively against a very dangerous threat. So, with my U.S. and the World hat on, what are some of the things that we might want the mainstream public to take away from Mike's book and from the work of others who are promoting more comprehensive, balanced, and reality-based approaches to counterterrorism, including reducing the threat of nuclear terrorism? We probably want the public to be realistically concerned and realistically confident of our ability to handle this threat. We don't want to prompt reckless panic, and we don't want to encourage kind of numb fatalism. This is inevitable, it's going to happen anyway. We want the public to understand that nuclear terrorism is part of a larger set of issues, not an isolated phenomenon. We probably want the public to be reinforced in its growing conviction that military force and unilateral action are not the only or the best ways to be safe in a complex and interconnected world. And we want the public probably to hear some big common sense messages about prevention, about cooperation, about connecting the dots and using all the tools in the toolbox. Big kind of common sense messages that actually apply across a full range of security issues and not just to nuclear terrorism. So our task as communicators then is to increase the odds of those kinds of public opinion outcomes. And that challenge is what I'm going to focus on for the rest of my remarks. I'm going to be drawing heavily on a meta-analysis that U.S. and the World commissioned last year, which looked at over 200 publicly available opinion surveys and focus groups on national security and related issues, which was carried out by a woman named Meg Bostrom, who founded an organization called Public Knowledge. My comments are going to fall under three broad headings, and I've tried to be a little bit humorous despite the prescription. The first heading is the fear factor. So it turns out that fear is a big subject of debate these days among advocates and experts who want to build support for more cooperative, far-sighted, effective national security policies. U.S. and the World hears these kinds of questions all the time. Tell us, does fear mobilize public support for our issues and our policy approaches? Is it a good idea to tell people that you're less safe now than you were before 9/11? How do we deal with the fact that fear is being used to generate support for policy approaches that we believe are short-sighted and reckless? If fear is at best a double-edged sword, how do we talk about scary things without evoking fear? Well, the meta-analysis and other scans of opinion research that we've done suggest that, in fact, the public's thinking about foreign policy is actually less driven by fear than many pundits assume it is. Safety is not the only lens that people use when they're reflecting on our place in the world. Given a choice, most people will prioritize a range of issues for attention. But when prompted to feel fear, the public's focus tends to narrow to more familiar military security concerns, even when those concerns don't show up as high priorities otherwise. For example, attacking countries that develop weapons of mass destruction actually falls near the bottom of the list when people are asked to rank the effectiveness of various security strategies. Interestingly enough, developing new nuclear weapons comes at the very bottom of the list. It's last on the list. But in the context of a conversation about nuclear terrorism, you could imagine that this strategy would rank considerably higher on such a list. Again, another example. The public estimates the likelihood of a nuclear terrorist attack really as being quite low. Only about 14% of the public in one survey seemed to think that it was particularly likely. But when asked a fear-inducing question, and I kid you not, this is literally the way the question was phrased in the survey, what foreign policy goals are absolute top priorities and need maximum immediate attention during the next 12 months, sure enough, preventing the smuggling of nuclear weapons into the United States topped the list. Researchers have also found that just asking subjects to think about their own death or giving them subliminal reminders of the 9/11 attacks led to significant increases in support for policies associated with the Bush administration's war on terror, regardless of party affiliation. So, as Mike has written, it's difficult to imagine a specter more frightening than nuclear terrorism. As he's also said, and you might not have talked so much about this, but I've had the advantage of reading some of your other articles, that kind of intense fear prompts people to want a perfect defense. I think that was implied in some of your remarks. What I'm suggesting here is that that kind of intense fear is also likely to lead the public to a preference for particular kinds of defense. Fear sends people down a path of reasoning that, frankly, is unlikely to take them to the kinds of balanced, cooperative, comprehensive policy prescriptions Mike and others might have in mind. Fear is also fungible. Intense fear about nuclear terrorism is likely to disadvantage all sorts of other responsible, far-sighted policy recommendations about diplomatic engagement with Iran, for example. So fear risks derailing the very positive trends in public thinking that we've been seeing about the danger of over-relying on the military and the cost of unilateral military intervention. And once people are derailed onto another path, it's very difficult to get them back and to get them to change course, because the frame that's guiding their thinking, the fear frame, simply doesn't accommodate the kind of nuanced arguments and facts that you might want to introduce. So how to talk about such a frightening issue? As I said, it's not easy. If you're trying to avoid the outcome that Mike described, where intense fear leads to the search for a perfect defense, you could start by saying there is no such thing as a perfect defense, but that may make people more frightened in the end. Or you could lead with, there's no need to be so frightened, but that may make people feel that you're dismissing their fear, and your audience ends up feeling weaker, not stronger, as a result, because they're still frightened, and you're telling them that they shouldn't be, and they're going to be angry at you, to boot, for making them feel that way. So the research that we've looked at, and this is not a definitive answer, we're learning too as we go along, suggests that one way to reduce the fear and head off the search for a perfect defense is to talk about what we can do to address the threat. Instead of leading with the problem, lead with the solutions. And don't let nuclear terrorism stand alone as the symbol of terrorism itself. And it just something, this is my own sort of sketch, something like, what we need is a focused, comprehensive strategy that takes advantage of every weak link in the chain between the planning and the execution of a terrorist attack. And there are many such links. Cooperative intelligence gathering and better homeland security measures are critical to preventing terrorist attacks of any kind, including nuclear. There are concrete steps we can take every day at home and in partnership with other nations to reduce the chances of a catastrophic event. Now, those are not tested messages, but what I'm proposing here is that a vision of overcoming adversity can be an antidote to fear, and that reinforcing such a vision can be a way of inoculating the public against future fear-based appeals. It's a communication strategy that takes fear seriously, but in a way that doesn't exacerbate it, and in fact builds confidence in our ability to address threats using the full array of tools available to us, working with other nations, thinking ahead and planning ahead. And survey after survey tells us that those are the kinds of security strategies the American public already embraces. So my second big heading is, you can't get there from here. Nuclear terrorism is an attention getter, and it's getting a lot of attention given concerns about Iran's nuclear program and increased interest in nuclear technology. So it's natural, right, to want to associate your issue with an issue that has such high salience. And in fact, with this hope in mind, many non-proliferation advocates are using nuclear terrorism as an entry point for their arguments. And some who want to criticize the Bush administration's approach to the war on terror are leading with the threat of nuclear terrorism too, in order to make the point that time has been wasted, we're less safe, there's a better way, there's a better answer. The problem is, you can't just acquire salience by association without also acquiring another frame and or another way of thinking. And it may be a frame that ends up undermining your own cause. What I've just reported to you about the impact of fear, I think, tells us how risky it is to count on the issue of nuclear terrorism to lead an audience away from the Bush administration's war on terror policies. But what about non-proliferation? The question U.S. and the world poses here is whether thinking about nuclear terrorism leads people to or takes them away from the conclusion that nuclear weapons proliferation is a shared threat requiring cooperative solutions based on shared norms, global rules, strict monitoring and verification, and global enforcement. Our sense is that in general, this isn't the path of reasoning that fear of nuclear terrorism leads people down. More likely, it takes them to self-protection, narrowly defined. And I say that especially since nuclear terrorism is most often framed as our problem rather than as a shared problem. An American city is evoked as the target of the attack, and anti-American terrorists are evoked as the perpetrators. So listeners are likely to conclude that this is a national security threat, rather narrowly conceived, and may not, in fact, be able to see it as a threat that's at the intersection of national and global security. Weapons in the hands of others and their use against us are the dangers in this picture, not an arms race that implicates many nations and has implications for all of humanity, which I think is the big picture that most non-proliferation advocates would like the public to see. In short, it's not entirely clear to me that you can get there, i.e. non-proliferation, from here, nuclear terrorism. The public is on board already when it comes to the importance of preventing the spread of nuclear weapons and the need for cooperation and for active U.S. global leadership in mobilizing global teamwork to that end. Does advocacy that leads with nuclear terrorism risk undermining some of that support? Are people even able to see nuclear terrorism as a proliferation problem? Or does it seem like something different, unrelated to the concept of spreading that's probably at the heart of the public's understanding of what proliferation is? It might, in other words, be more effective to bring the issue in later, after you've already got people thinking in terms of working together with others to tackle tough challenges that no nation can handle alone. I want to close with a reminder that a message to the general public is not the same as a detailed policy prescription or a nuanced threat assessment or a collection of facts and figures. So my last heading is, what is in that kind of a message? A message is the big idea, the big story that tells your listeners what your issue is about, why it matters, and how it's connected to other things that people understand and care about. If we choose the right big story, the right frame, our listeners will be able to take in our more detailed facts and arguments. Choose the wrong frame, and our listeners may end up tuning out or reaching some conclusion that's not at all what we intended. It's not easy to talk about a fearsome threat like nuclear terrorism without inadvertently narrowing or sidetracking or paralyzing public thinking. The communications challenge, as I've tried to describe it here, is to make framing choices that leave our audiences realistically confident about prospects for managing this deadly threat and equipped with some common sense principles for assessing proposed solutions, not searching for the perfect solution that we know doesn't exist. Thanks.
Well, we've got about a little less than 45 minutes for questions. One of the sort of unusual things is when we've got this many chairs in the room, we don't have a microphone that can go around. So when we do take questions, I'll take a couple of questions, and then I'm going to have to repeat them up here so that they're captured in the audio and so that everyone can hear them. But I just wanted to kick us off by asking both of you a question, which is if there was one myth or meme in the way we talk about or think about nuclear terrorism that you could strike from the face of this earth, what would it be?
All right. Can I use the opportunity just to make one comment here that I think is really... I just want to give a really quick story on this framing bit. Because people who look at nuclear terrorism love to talk about an incident that happened just after 9/11. A gentleman codenamed Dragonfire told the U.S. government that there was a bomb in New York City, and everyone freaked out, and they did all sorts of things inside the government to make sure this wasn't real, and it turned out it was a hoax. And this is very frequently given as an example of why nuclear terrorism is an enormous, likely threat. Well, if your frame is that it's really likely, then the fact that you were scared by a hoax reinforces the fact that it's really likely. If your frame is that it's not likely, then the fact it was a hoax probably tells you that it's not likely. So these kinds of things are really pervasive in this. That's just a quick little bit. One myth or bit that I would break is that nuclear terrorism is some completely separate subject from the rest of terrorism. Okay. So there's a reason why the book focuses on honest-to-goodness mushroom cloud bombs as opposed to other nuclear terrorism. Here's the line you hear a lot. This whole idea of a system and comprehensive and whatnot makes tons of sense for a lot of terrorism, but nuclear is different. There's one part that's a lot harder, and it's true that acquiring materials and weapons in the first place is by far the hardest part. But the other stuff is so easy that it's just completely different from the rest. I come to a very different conclusion, which is that for the broader defense, most of what you want to do is not nuclear specific at all. And to the extent that it is nuclear, it's putting little nuclear adornments on standard non-nuclear tools. So that would be the myth that these are sort of nuclear terrorism and terrorism are two totally different subjects.
Yeah, I would very much agree with that observation. but also say that one of the things that I would like to see happen in the public's mind would be avoiding the equation of nuclear terrorism with terrorism. And I was struck by, and I don't mean that in a technical sense. What I actually read your article in USA Today, Mike, and I don't know if you read some of the posts in response to it, but they were good examples, you know, of kinds of thoughts that people bring to their reading of such an article. And I was struck by how many of them just talked about terrorism. I mean, here was an article about nuclear terrorism, but they read it entirely in terms of what should we do about terrorism. And you're telling us something about terrorism as distinct from something about a particular instance and a particular worst case of terrorism. So it's sort of the flip side of what you're talking about. It doesn't at all take away from what you're saying, but it was just an observation about the majority of those letters.
Reading anything in response to something
Yeah,
is very dangerous.
You probably don't want to do it. I took that burden.
All right, well, we'll go with these three. So John Fox, then Jonathan Tucker, and yeah.
So if we're supposed to think about nuclear terrorism simply a subset of terrorism, what would the panelists say about the vast amount of money that's proposed to be spent for radiation detection and things like that? And also, it's terrific to propose a different framework for thinking about these things. And perhaps if you were in an administration, you wanted to say, this is how we're going to think about it, this is how we're going to go about it. But it seems like a lot of the knee-jerk reaction to 9/11 and security things on a nuclear front has sort of manifested itself in Congress, sort of a version of demagoguery. People up there saying, we need to check everything, let's scan everything abroad. And, you know, it seems like there's a huge gulf between what you're proposing and trying to get people to actually look at it that way. And I was curious what...
And I should encourage people, I'm going to take several because I've got to repeat them so people can hear. And do introduce yourself, but I happen to know that's John Fox with Global Security Newswire. Jonathan?
Okay, taking a somewhat broader picture, what is the relationship in your view between state-level proliferation and the threat of nuclear terrorism? And what can be done in the context of a nuclear non-proliferation regime, the NPT and other treaties, to deal with this threat? Or are terrorists really operating in a realm outside the non-proliferation regime?
Great. These are wonderful examples of the kind of short and succinct questions that mean lots of people get to ask. And then finally in the back.
Steve Marmolette, British American Security Information Council. I really like your presentation, and particularly the emphasis on the difficulty in actually fabricating a bomb. But I want to present to you a scenario that you didn't address and get your comment on it. And it's this. A group of Chechens either coerce or bribe their way into possession of a tactical nuke and drive without stop for Red Square and set it off. Is this likely, less likely? Where does that fit in your
Okay, great.
spectrum of possibilities?
Three outstanding questions. One is about radiation detectors and really how you match the scale of the response to the sort of the political needs of getting people's attention. The link between state sponsors and nuclear terrorism, and particularly what this means for the NPT, and then finally the Chechen terrorists who drive to Red Square.
Okay, maybe we should go. My pen has run out, but I remember these questions because they're great questions. John, the word Congress came up in what you said, and I think it is important. I, like many people I work with, are in a habit of criticizing the administration on a lot of different things. In the case of radiation detection and this whole 100% container scanning business, frankly, is Congress's fault. And the folks I talked to in the administration would love if they weren't being forced into doing that because it is an enormous waste of money. Now, that does not mean that container security and scanning is a waste of money in and of itself. And let me tell you very quickly what I mean. I'll give you 2 points, and one on containers, one on radiation detection in general. Firstly, on containers, what you're probably looking at is something to deter the use of containers as means of smuggling nuclear materials or weapons, okay? And if there are alternative approaches to smuggling available, excellent. I can't write with my left hand, but I'll try to do both at once. If there are alternative approaches, at some point you have enough defense that the marginal value of additional defense is not that high because people are going to go to other routes. On top of that, what we call 100% scanning isn't really 100% scanning, or at least 100% detection. It's 100% scanning with perhaps 10% effective machines. That's not what I think of as 100%. Here's the big question is how much is enough in that deterrence context? And I know that's actually something that people are really grappling with inside government right now. How much is enough? I mean, it's just, do you have some vague general feeling? One thing I've pushed on that is you actually need to do some kind of intelligence experiments. So it's not just about watching what people do. I mean, in diplomacy often, there'll be coordination between policymakers and intelligence folks, where policymakers will take a step with the intent of having the intelligence community look at the response and try to understand the interaction. We should be doing that to try to understand sort of how influence and deterrence, these kinds of things, play out with terrorist groups. The problem is we've spent 5 years convincing everyone that deterrence is irrelevant when it comes to terrorism. So there's a bit of an uphill battle to move back. And again, I think attitudes in the administration are more evolved than a lot of the ones in Congress. On radiation detection in general, I would focus on things that boost the ability of non-nuclear capabilities. So rather than string borders with super fancy disco ball type 360-degree detectors that cost $10 million a pop, why not give Border Patrol people cheap, robust, simple detectors so that when they catch someone crossing the southern border, which actually is quite likely, people just make it through because they get a lot of tries. If they have plutonium in their backpack, they don't get another try, right? These are cheaper, simpler things, but you get them when you're blending with non-nuclear. So that's that. State proliferation and non-state. I mean, there are a couple links. There are a couple obvious links. One is when states that do not have a lot of experience with nuclear weapons don't tend to be as good in everything else being equal in handling them and controlling them. Okay? So that is something to be concerned about. And I should say that doesn't require the proliferation of weapons, it just requires the proliferation of dangerous materials. The other that people worry about is the deliberate transfer of nuclear weapons or materials from a state to a non-state group. I think that's extraordinarily unlikely, but it's something that that should be in our picture, and we could get very deep, and I won't, into the question of being able to attribute attacks to their sources and whether you can build a deterrence policy on top of that. We seem to be hoping that technology will deliver a policy and a strategy when we actually have to look at complementary pieces there. There's also some very silly stuff going on, threatening countries that you're going to retaliate if they inadvertently let something out that's going to get in the way of them cooperating in advance to give you samples of their materials. No one wants to give you the cookbook to tracing attacks to them so that you can wipe them off the map. But on top of that, I'd just say that the biggest concern about proliferation is going to be regional nuclear war or regional conventional war under a nuclear umbrella. It's not the terrorist part. So the terrorist dimension is there, but I wouldn't put it at the absolute top of the list. And what can be done in the context of the non-proliferation regime, and I wouldn't equate that with the NPT. I think it would be to, again, focus on the basics of the NPT. We can get into a very long discussion about that. I don't know that there's anything that's all that terrorism specific for the NPT. There could be things about international standards for security over materials. There are things in the UN context. The UN Security Council Resolution 1540 provides a framework for a lot of cooperation on nuclear security. The problem is we've got a lot of these frameworks, we've got a lot of architectures. We need to, we have enough architects, we need to move on to the engineering. We need to actually put the meat on the bones and work together on that. That's a lot harder than passing a UN Security Council resolution sometimes. Group of Chechens break in and drive a bomb to Red Square. That would be a big, big problem. And
only if you lived in Red Square.
Or within a mile or so, or downwind. I mean, again, there's some complicated parts there. Tactical weapons often have locks on them and so on. But what I'll actually use this to make a different point, which is, again, we don't want to replace these things that I would put in the worst case category with less than worst case. We want to look at these range of possible threats. Against that threat, the focus is on keeping these things under control, okay? And again, that's not super straightforward. I'd really love Russia not to put emphasis on tactical nuclear weapons in their nuclear weapons policy, but frankly, if they go out of military hands and get put in a shed somewhere, they may be more likely to be acquired. So it's complicated. What I say is, if you have a problem that can't be dealt with this broader defense don't try to deal with it with the broader defense. I mean, that's part of our problem. We come to radiation detection, we're trying to detect things that we can't detect. So we want to focus these broader defenses on things that they can actually be effective against, assuming that they deal with enough of a chunk of the problem, rather than trying to make every piece of the defense effective against every kind of plot.
Priscilla, did you have something specific in mind? Because I had a question for you about the way that we frame this, which is, I mean, we almost always exclusively talk about this as a U.S. threat, threat to U.S. cities, and so the Chechen example strikes me as a very interesting, raises an interesting set of questions about how we think and talk about this. I mean, is this, I mean, as Mike says, you worry about terrorism and that's a problem everywhere, and then this is just a sort of unique version, or how do you?
Well, as I said, and I heard that too. I mean, I think that was an unusual scenario. I don't think that Americans are asked very often to contemplate that possibility. I think it's almost always talked about in terms of U.S.-centric attacks. So I think that there is room to explore and experiment with different ways of talking about this problem that would put it more in the category of a global terrorist threat that we need to work together in a variety of ways, as well as taking our own steps to address. So I thought that really stood out to me too. The only other thing I would say about the question about Congress is, and it's sort of it's really an admission of not knowing. I don't think we know what the American public thinks would be enough. That's not a conversation that's being had. We're having a conversation about all or nothing kinds of measures, and I think it would be really interesting to have some thought experiments.
The question is it a matter of enough defense or enough jobs for port workers, or what exactly? So I mean, these things get tied up. There's a lot of pork involved in some of these.
I have to spare a pen because I'm going to try to keep track of the questions. Thanks. Oh, okay, so we've got here and then here and in the front, and then we'll go. Walt, you'll get your own since you're New America Family.
David Wallace with Edelman Public Relations. I have two technical questions, Michael, that you've already alluded to, but two of the nuclear terror scenarios. One is that a terrorist organization gets hold of a nuclear warhead from, they buy one from scientists in Russia or something. How difficult is a warhead to trigger? Because you did allude to blocks before on the attachment of nuclear weapon. And then second, the other scenario is say Pakistan and the SSI or something, gives a warhead to or nuclear bomb to Al Qaeda. How traceable are nuclear weapons to, as far as country of origin?
Great questions, and then.
Pauline Baker, the Fund for Peace. My question is for Priscilla. I was very interested in the premise of your research and the meta-analysis that fear does not work in generating public interest. Yet political research has concluded just the opposite, that fear does get public interest, and it is the basis of all the negative campaigning and the negative ads that come out in order to get public attention. So how do you square that kind of research and the way politicians communicate with the public with your own information?
Sean Barnett at the Institute for Defense Analyses. I had a question for Michael. How would you contrast what you're advocating with what we're doing now in the way of trying to prevent nuclear terrorism? Could you talk a little bit about where we could do more and where we might be able to back off a little bit?
Okay, those are several great questions. For the record, they are, the first is how difficult would it be for a group of terrorists to detonate a stolen Russian warhead? I guess that's a question about permissive action links and whatnot. And then the subset of that is, if the ISI were to give a Pakistani nuclear weapon to al-Qaeda, what could we do in terms of nuclear forensics? The second question, which I think is especially important, is given that we know, or at least we seem to have pretty good evidence that fear drives attention, how do you square that with fear maybe not necessarily driving the policies you want? And my own add-on to that would be, I spent a year at the Belfer Center where Graham Allison kept talking about how there's a 50% chance in the next decade, and Matt Bunn wrote a very nice dissertation where I forget, did Matt come up with 3 or 5% chance a year? But compounded over 10 years, 5% is 40% chance. So both, is that kind of math helpful? I suppose is something I would add to that. And then the final question was to Mike, which is what more could and should we do?
Right.
Mike, do you want to take yours first, and then we'll go to?
Sure, and I'm going to weigh in on that second little part that you added on.
Okay.
Because you know that
I know.
have some thoughts about that.
That was called baiting you.
A nuclear warhead, buy one from a scientist. Firstly, scientists won't have access to these sorts of things, but from a military type person, how hard is it to trigger? The Russian warheads, so first thing is, again, I want to put it in a system context. Warheads are, it's hard for a warhead to go missing without someone noticing, okay? Both because there's a lot of security, Park Sale incident notwithstanding.
Yes.
And, but again,
They eventually noticed.
sometimes that happens, but how confident are you as a terrorist group that that's how it's going to turn out? And also, they're relatively straightforward to count. They eventually notice 18 hours later, it's not necessarily easy to go from start to finish in a nuclear terrorist plot within 18 hours. So that's the one systems piece, I'd say, is that all has to be done possibly within the context of someone on your trail. And a terrorist group would have to anticipate that possibility when it decides what to do. Just that bit of context. That's at a technical level, you have something called permissive action links, where you essentially have a code system built into the guts of the warhead, and if you get it wrong, the thing is disabled. Are there ways around it? Yeah, if you talk to people in classified circles, my understanding is they will tell each other there are ways around it. Again, can the terrorist group figure that out? Are they confident they know what they're doing? On top of it, there's a whole other system with a lot of these warheads that they basically have to go through the sequence of experiences that a warhead on a missile would have on its way to a target. So you have to simulate somehow, again, unless you can get around that system, you have to simulate the acceleration, the change in atmospheric concentration and pressure and so on. So again, complications, again, I wouldn't want to rule it out, but there are a bunch of these barriers. Pakistan, someone gives a kind of bomb, how traceable is it? Unclear. We have
And I mean traceable after detonation.
Yes. Well, so a lot of clues you would use in tracing a weapon get wiped out after detonation. A lot of them would still survive. There's certain details of the materials we call isotopic composition and things like that. I won't get into fine details. I would just recommend that the American Association for the Advancement of Science will be publishing a good study on this in about a month.
Co-chaired by Mike May.
Nicely accessible. Chaired by Mike May. Which inevitably means it will be a really nice piece of research and writing. But you can also learn different things. For example, we have certain little pieces of advantage on Pakistan. One is that we have a good idea of what their design is, because we found it, for example, in Iran. Libya. In Libya.
Don't jump the gun yet.
Not on the laptop. In Libya. And knowing the design of a weapon can also, certain designs will lead to certain changes in the material through detonation. So there are different things you might do. But I wouldn't be hugely confident. Now, if there's international cooperation on having databases of materials so that you have something to match it to, that'd be great. But to get that kind of cooperation from Pakistan, at a minimum, you would need to not threaten to retaliate against them if you could trace something to them. Frankly, I don't see a retaliation against them anyhow in that kind of case. It's not good to wipe out your best bet for preventing a second attack.
All right, what about Graham and Matt?
Graham and Matt. I don't think the numbers really mean much. What matters more is how you get to them. It's sometimes if you do a little model, it can structure your thinking. The numbers come largely out of nowhere. It's a gut feeling. Matt did a little model that was a sort of 3-stage model. I think that's nice because it illuminates some things. It structures your thinking, but frankly, the numbers in those things often come out the way you want them to come out. And once you make them too complicated, they obscure all the interesting stuff and all the useful stuff. I also say one thing that, and again, I'll say it quickly because I assume most people here haven't looked at this. The one set of models that could be interesting are ones that also don't only predict the likelihood of an attack, but that predict the likelihood of certain kinds of failures. Because those are actually things you can go out there and look for. And if you look at that particular model, it pretty much predicts that we would have caught someone with a nuclear bomb by now, which we haven't. So that may tell us something. So there's some interesting dimensions there. How do I contrast with what we're doing? We can do that in a lot of different ways. I said something about the sort of radiation detection, border security measures. When I would, and again, I could have my 78-point plan, but I would say, so for example, we should be doing more together with the Russians to increase the likelihood that we'll get information if something is missing. Okay, very difficult to do. If you go ask someone at the Department of Energy headquarters how long it would take to get information from the Russians, their response will be, how long do you think it would take for us to get information if something went missing in Los Alamos? Tells you a bit of a lesson. But I would also, again, start putting more meat on the bones of this cooperation at the low levels, at law enforcement levels, things like this. The FBI did a great conference in Miami last year to train law enforcement folks from around the world on these things. Problem is that you went and looked at the folks who attended, and it was essentially people from countries that already knew what they were doing, because the other ones couldn't afford to come to this meeting. Okay? So that's a place that you can fill in. This stuff is cheap. I mean, I'd spend $50 million over 10 years to put together an office to do systems analysis on these things. I would test programs much more carefully. I would not only test them with worst cases, and I would exercise them much more broadly. So there are a lot of different things. I also have a variety of models for emergency response when something happens. We're fixated only on the 10-kiloton Hiroshima-sized bomb. I became convinced while doing this that at least as likely as a nuclear terrorist attack that's about 10 times the size of Oklahoma City, 10 to 50 times that size. It's a totally different kind of response plan.
Priscilla, you want to give us a little bit?
Sort of work backwards to Pauline's question.
Great.
Jeffrey, your observation about what kind of math prompts me to say that I think Americans, and maybe people in general, are notoriously bad risk assessors, right? I mean, the notion being that we are all inclined to be much more frightened of highly unlikely but very disastrous happenings than we are to be frightened of things that are much more likely to happen but much smaller and less frightening sounding. So, which leads me to say that part of what you're talking about, it seems to me, is part of a real research agenda. You know, we don't know how to take people out of a conversation that's driving them to kind of reckless panic or numb fatalism. We don't know how to bridge from that conversation to a different conversation. There is some research of a communications nature and of a messaging nature that I think is really critical. And part of it might have to do with what kind of math helps, if any. And secondly, who the messenger is. Is Matt Bunn going to reassure people? Are you going to reassure people, or is it instead the local minister or the imam who is
the fire chief,
you know, or the fire chief who's reassuring people? So the messenger is part of the message, and we just don't know the answers to those questions. Pauline and Jeffrey kind of reframed your question too, which and gave away in some ways what I would say, which is that it's absolutely the case that fear is a factor in salience. I mean, it drives attention, it gets attention. I think what our research looks at is what kind of reasoning process the fear launches. So what do people do once they're frightened? And I think it's at that level that we have cause for concern about the effectiveness of fear in leading people toward the kind of understanding and policy preferences that we'd like to see. And I will just say one other quick thing to sort of make that point in a more nuanced way. You know, here I am saying that that frightening people to death about nuclear terrorism is not necessarily the best way to build support for a comprehensive and balanced and cooperative set of policies. I've been in many conversations with people in the peace and security community who would say, but wait a minute, in the nuclear freeze movement, fear was really, really effective. Well, here's where you can look at a nuance, I think, that actually confirms the importance of getting under the surface, which is, I believe, that the nuclear Armageddon was a shared global fate. This was a fear about a global fate. It was not a fear about something directed exclusively at us. It was a fear that derived from a circumstance that we had helped to create. We made this system. Maybe we can dismantle this system. So I don't have all of the answers, but again, I just want to point to what goes on beneath the surface of the fear, and even suggest that some kinds of fear may be more effective at communicating what we want to communicate than others. We have reason to be fearful that this particular kind of fear is not as helpful as some people are perhaps thinking it is.
I thought you were going to say that when you said Americans are notoriously bad risk assessors, I thought you were going to say they're notoriously bad at math.
Oh, and that too.
By the way, I should say, we tease Bun a little bit, but his dissertation has a remarkable model, which I think is, as Mike says, is actually one of the very best attempts I've ever seen to try to systematically identify all of the steps and talk about the risk associated with each of them. And so I would highly recommend picking up a copy of the dissertation, but if the math is a little frightening, there's a slightly easier, more accessible version in the Annals of Political Science, right? The issue that Graham Allison edited. So I would recommend that to you, despite the fact that we tease Bun, who we love.
Matt gets one of the 2 individual thank yous in the book. He's at the top of the game.
Walt?
I had a question for Mike, which is about consequence management. During the Cold War, civil defense was hopeless. My experience in the Pentagon, we could do simulations, was that in fact preparation for dealing with the consequences could make a huge difference. It was always a very bad thing, but it made a huge difference about how serious it was on the scale. And I just wondered if you had any observations about consequence management, because I think to some degree it affects attitudes toward the whole problem, or whether it's hopeless even after it's happened.
So for the record, that was a question about consequence management and whether it, in this particular case, could actually be quite an important mitigating tool.
Yes. It's been taboo in the nuclear area for a long time, in part because I think people thought that if you talk about consequence management, then if the consequences are manageable in some sense, then you're not going to spend as much effort stopping it. I think we're scared enough about what would happen that it's not going to turn out that way, and people are realizing the need to talk about it. I think the most influential thing in breaking the taboo recently was, I guess, a piece of work last year by Bill Perry, Ash Carter, and Mike May on, I guess, the day after, which was very good. And I was heartened by that because it was something I'd spent some time on writing this book. It was, had been written but wasn't out yet. It is very important. Look, nuclear attack is an absolute catastrophe, absolutely horrible. But it's hard for me to explain to myself why making straightforward preparations that could turn something into from 200,000 people dying to 100,000 people dying isn't worth doing. As long as it doesn't mean we're going away from the other part. I mean, part of this also during the Cold War, the context was that somehow this meant that it would be better it wouldn't be so bad to start a nuclear war and this sort of thing. This is much more one-sided, so there's no morality angle that comes in like there did during the Cold War. So it can make a big difference, and also with smaller explosions it can make an even bigger difference. So simple things can absolutely be useful on that front, and I think we may actually have a response plan by it. Now, I'd also though say it's not just about physical response. It's about trying to make sure that political confidence isn't totally cut out, everything from continuity of government to working with the rest of the world to make sure that there isn't a second attack. There's a whole range of consequence management things that I would think about.
Okay, another set of 3 questions. Deborah and then Diane. Why do I always do that, Diane?
Well, you're not dealing with it. I'm Diane Perlman. I'm a clinical and political psychologist, and I actually started my work around the nuclear freeze movement on psychology of nuclear proliferation and the image of the enemy and manipulation of the enemy image and fear. So this is more toward Priscilla. Well, it seems like, Michael, your book is more highly developed within a particular frame of how we deal with the symptom. So I just want to raise the issue of the frame of that is almost absent in discourse, which is how you reduce the desire of people to take revenge on us. And this framing of the enemies that they hate us, they want to kill us, and a concrete thinking of that's who they are, rather than looking at the dynamics. And you referred to terror management theory of if someone does a 20-minute psych experiment and if there's actually like living, like actual fear, trauma, and humiliation, and there's kind of dismissal of policies like detention reduction, security assurances, which actually have a higher probability of reducing the risk.
Okay, and?
First of all, I just want to
could you introduce yourself?
Oh, Bob Shadler, American Foreign Policy Council. I want to
compliment you on, I can't imagine two people who are more cheerful, if not happy, discussing nuclear terrorism. It's astounding and impressive. My question, though, is somewhat related to an earlier one. To a very large degree, fear among the public is what oils and facilitates taking defensive actions against it. On the other hand, fear resulting in kind of widespread panic might well cost as many lives as an actual event. And so I don't know if there's a dimension of trying to educate the public so they have a sense that it's a real thing that needs to be defended against, but yet there are practical things each family or individual can do to minimize it in that eventuality.
So two great questions. One about the sort of role of the other in structuring the description of the threat and driving fear, and the other, going back to this question of consequence management and focusing on whether or not panic might not be the most dangerous thing. To that, I would add, I mean, do we need to see a resumption of the old Bert the Turtle cartoons from the 1950s on civil defense? Just, get under your school desk, or what is the appropriate way to sort of mitigate panic in the aftermath of an event?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah,
First question.
These are such good and difficult questions. Diana, as you were asking your question, I found myself thinking that we come closer to having that conversation in the context of nuclear proliferation, right? Because people look at arcs of tension and of conflict and are more ready to talk about the kinds of conditions and conflicts and tensions that induce the desire to possess or develop nuclear weapons. I think it's a much harder conversation to have with the public when they're imagining a terrorist having his finger or her finger on a nuclear weapon, which argues perhaps for what I just speculated in my address, that we come to nuclear terrorism after we've done some of the talking about what a smart non-proliferation and comprehensive non-proliferation strategy really looks like. So it's not a full answer to what you're talking about, but it's just an acknowledgement that that's more present in the non-proliferation conversation and even in the war on terrorism conversation than it is in the conversation about nuclear terrorism as such. It's awfully hard to... Oh, and it actually also reminded me, this is a nuance, but maybe an important one. As we think about perhaps the recommendation of talking about solutions and what we could do, it did seem to me that some of the materials I read told that story from the perspective of the terrorist. A terrorist wants to do X. Here's how we can stop it. Then a terrorist wants to do Y. It keeps the focus on this sort of fuzzy terrorist who means us harm. And it might be interesting to experiment with sort of turning that around and putting the emphasis on what we're doing rather than on what they're trying to do to us. So just a kind of a nuance and a way of perhaps indirectly responding to your observation about how we imagine the enemy and how we make use of that imagination.
Now, you were talking a bit about sort of reducing the motivations for terrorist groups, and I just make one very quick comment on that. If your picture of a nuclear terrorist attack is something that 5 guys who decide they're in a bad mood can pull off, then frankly reducing the motivations for terrorism is not a particularly useful way to deal with that, because you're not going to get down to the last 5 guys. If it's something that A, requires a bigger group, but B, involves steps where it's important that the community around you not turn you in and things like that, those things aren't as hard, then it's much more important to have that part of the puzzle there. So that's just one quick thing I would say to that. And that's part of that in this book also is not everything needs to be said, but you have the framework, you can plug these sorts of things in and see how they work. Now, I wasn't quite sure, were you talking about, I thought I heard you talking about fear and panic before an attack and driving how we plan. You talked about it as after an attack. Which were you getting at?
Well, to some degree both. I mean, the fear is being used to facilitate, fear becomes a public political motivation to do things. But I was thinking mostly because of that environment, should something then happen, people's fears are so revved up that getting out of Washington may cause more deaths than an event that might be in Boston.
Right, well, there will be panic if there is a nuclear attack, and nothing we do in advance is going to eliminate that. But what we can do is prepare to manage it. Just really simple things. If we prepare with, if we go out there with 7 different messages of what the heck to do and what's going on, you're going to have some problems. Just having some coordination is one of those simple things. Figuring out the right messenger. In my experiences, it is the fire chief. So those sorts of things you can think about. And frankly, odds are the best response to almost any attack you can think of is to stay where you are and move to the middle of your building. If you're in a short building, move to the basement. If you're in just that little piece, I don't even do duck and cover or whatever the heck it is. Just knowing that it's not run the heck out of town so that you can be exposed to the fallout cloud as you're going and get in a traffic jam where you will be even more exposed. Very simple things. And it's very important in these cases not to look for the best possible response strategy, but for the best one that people will actually follow.
Well, I think that is an excellent place to wind things up. Do either of you a little practical advice from Mike in the event that
we'll do the drill right now. I have a taller table than your chair. So.
I highly recommend that you all, or at least the first, 15 of you, however many copies we have, pick up a copy of Mike's book and join me in thanking Mike and Priscilla.